Hey everyone, you hear stories about haunted places, but this one is happening right now. To me, I've lived on this same quiet street my whole life. Old houses, peeling paint, flickering porch lights, but the streetlights have turned strange. They always flickered when I passed. I assumed it was bad wiring. Then, last night, the light outside my house exploded as glass rained down. Every other light on the street died at once. Something was welcoming me home. Subscribe, and I'll show you what's waiting in the dark. Ryan's Basement. In the world of entrepreneurship and content creation, we talk a lot about legacy. We build brands, systems, and platforms designed to outlast us. We are architects of the new, but some legacies aren't built. They're inherited. They fester in the dark, monuments to a past that refuses to be bulldozed. Ryan's house was one of those. He lived just a few doors down from me, in the oldest structure on the block. It was a structural relic, a holdout from a different era that the surrounding suburban sprawl had failed to digest. The house didn't just look old, it felt wrong. It sagged under the weight of its own history, radiating a persistent chill that defied the humid afternoon air. And the smell, it wasn't just musty. It was a complex, layered scent of damp plaster, decomposing timber, and something vaguely metallic, like old pennies. Ryan was, like many of us are, a product of his environment, a little reckless, drawn to the unconventional, and fundamentally bored. I was the safe friend, the one who calculated the risks. But that day, the allure of a new video game, a bootleg copy of something we absolutely shouldn't have had, overrode my usual diligence. "He's not home," Ryan said, shouldering the warped front door open. "My grandpa went to the market. We can use the old console in the basement." Curiosity, the engine of all discovery and all ruin, pulled me in. The house was cold, just as I'd imagined. Our footsteps didn't just sound, they echoed, the acoustics all wrong, as if the house were hollower than it appeared. We bypassed the living room, a museum of plastic-covered furniture, and headed for the basement door. The descent was where the first real tendrils of doubt curled in. The wooden stairs groaned under our weight, each step a complaint. The air grew thicker, colder, the smell intensified. A single, naked bulb hung at the bottom, its weak yellow light a pathetic attempt to challenge the gloom. It was an underfunded operation, this illumination, and it failed spectacularly. The light barely touched the concrete floor before being swallowed by the oppressive shadows. "This place is deeper than I thought," I murmured, my voice sounding thin. "It keeps going," Ryan said, already halfway down. "The game setup is in the back." We reached the bottom. The concrete was cold enough to feel through the soles of my sneakers. The ceiling was low, thick with cobwebs that hung like funeral shrouds. And the yellow light, it didn't just fail to reach the back wall, it seemed to recoil from it, as if afraid of what it might find. "Where's the console?" I asked, pulling my jacket tighter. My breath was fogging. Ryan pointed. "Over there, past this junk." This junk was not junk. It was a collection. My eyes, slowly adjusting to the gloom, found the first one. It was hanging from a ceiling pipe by a loop of fishing line, a small porcelain doll, its painted blue eyes wide and vacant. Then I saw the others. It wasn't one or two. There were dozens. They were suspended from the rafters, from exposed pipes, from rusted hooks set into the ceiling, a gallery of the grotesque. They hung in a loose constellation, turning almost imperceptibly in the drafts we had created. There were rag dolls with button eyes, plastic baby dolls with mottled skin, and elegant porcelain figures in rotting lace dresses. This was the discovery phase, the moment an entrepreneur realizes the market is not what they thought. This wasn't a playroom. This was a showroom. My curiosity, that bright, driving force, had now soured into something cold and heavy. It was the terror phase, the sudden, sickening realization that you are in the wrong room, talking to the wrong people. and have staked everything on a fatal miscalculation. "Ryan," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "what is this?" He'd stopped, too. His bravado had evaporated, replaced by a confusion that was rapidly hardening into fear. I don't know. I've never come this far back." The weak yellow light caught the edges of them. We were standing on the periphery of their silent gathering, and in the very centre, slightly apart from the others, as if holding court, was the doll. It was larger than the rest, maybe 2 feet tall, wearing a faded red velvet dress. Its porcelain face was a spiderweb of cracks, a network of fine fractures that converged on its mouth. And the mouth itself, it was stained. A dark reddish-brown patina clung to the chipped porcelain lips and dribbled down its chin. It wasn't paint. It was too thick, too organic. It looked, precisely, like dried blood. I felt a primal urge to touch it, to verify, the same way you'd poke a dead animal. I took a step closer. The smell of rust and rot was strongest here. I could see the fine, dark hairs matted to its cracked scalp. I could see the stain on its teeth. Before my hand could even get close, a guttural roar erupted from the top of the stairs, a sound of pure, unadulterated panic. "Get out of there, now!" We both screamed. Ryan's grandfather stood silhouetted against the light of the kitchen. His face, when he descended into the yellow glow, was not angry. It was blood-drained, pale with a terror that dwarfed our own. He looked like a CEO who had just seen his life's work corrupted by a fatal virus. "What did you touch? Get out! You don't know what you've done. Get out!" He didn't wait for us. He grabbed us, one by the collar, and physically hauled us back up the stairs, his grip like iron. We tumbled out into the kitchen, gasping, our hearts hammering. He slammed the basement door shut, the sound final, and fumbled with a large iron bolt I'd never noticed before, sliding it home. He turned to us, breathing heavily, his eyes wide. He looked past us, through us, back at the door. "You never go down there. You never go down there. Do you understand me?" He didn't need an answer. He dragged Ryan to his room, and I was thrown out of the house, the front door slamming behind me. I ran home, but the image was seared into my mind. The cracked face, the velvet dress, the dried blood. The next day, the need to know, that incurable itch of the creator, was overwhelming. I had to see. I watched Ryan's house. I waited until I saw the grandfather leave in his old truck. I found Ryan, who looked like he hadn't slept. "We have to look," I said. He refused. He was terrified, but I was more terrified of not knowing. I convinced him. We went back. The house was silent. The bolt on the basement door was thrown open. "He must have left it," Ryan whispered, his voice trembling. I pushed the door open. The same cold, musty air wafted up. I crept down the stairs, Ryan a few steps behind me. I reached the bottom. The yellow light was still on, but the basement was empty. The hooks were still there. The loops of fishing line and wire still dangled from the rafters, twisting slightly. But the dolls, all of them, gone, vanished. It was a complete liquidation, a cover-up. "He must have moved them," Ryan breathed, a wave of relief washing over his face. "No," I said, pointing. The relief died instantly. There, on the damp concrete floor, directly beneath where the doll in the red dress had been, lay a single object. It was a small white child's shoe, the kind with a buckle. It was old, yellowed with age, and splattered across the toe, just like the doll's mouth, was a dark, flaking stain of dried blood. We stared at it. The smoking gun, the one piece of data that didn't fit, the detail that unraveled the entire narrative. Ryan started to cry, quiet, terrified sobs. He was up all night, Ryan whispered, backing away toward the stairs. He was talking to himself. I heard him. What did he say? I asked, unable to look away from the shoe. He just kept saying it, over and over. He said, "The doll always comes back for its owner." I finally understood the grandfather's panic. It wasn't that we had found his secret. It was that we had interrupted something. We ran. We never spoke of it again. But as a creator, as a builder, I've learned that you can't just delete a project. The data always remains. That basement has haunted my adult life, not as a memory of fear, but as the ultimate cold case. What was the mechanism? What was the purpose of that collection? And I still think about that shoe. I think about the blood. And I think about that final, chilling line. Was it a warning? A lament? Or was it a simple statement of process? A guarantee on a product that performs its one terrible function every single time? The doll always comes back for its owner. The only question left was, who exactly was the owner? The call from the closet. The thing about confronting an evil brother is that you always expect a definitive win or a definitive loss, a final battle, a closing of the books. What you don't plan for is the alternative, a strategic retreat, a simple relocation of assets. After that night, the activity at Ryan's apartment didn't just stop, it evaporated. The oppressive weight in the air vanished. The shadows retreated to their mundane corners, and the silence was just silence. Ryan, fragile but immensely relieved, began the work of reclaiming his space. We both allowed ourselves to breathe, convinced, perhaps naively, that the ritual, the confrontation, or perhaps just our sheer terrified resistance, had been enough. We'd faced the abyss, and the abyss had blinked. But the abyss hadn't blinked. It had just moved. The problem wasn't solved, it had merely been transferred. And the new address was mine. My apartment had always been my sanctuary, my headquarters. As a creative, it was the one place where the chaos was mine to control. It was orderly, quiet, and predictable. A sterile environment where I could deconstruct the madness of the world outside. Now, that sterility was compromised. It began subtly, not with a bang, but with a whisper. At first, I dismissed it as auditory fatigue. The long nights, the stress bleeding over from Ryan's situation, it had to be that. I'd be working late, buried in an edit, and I'd catch it at the edge of my hearing, a faint, sibilant hiss, like sand pouring slowly down a chute, or the dry static of an untuned radio. It seemed to emanate from the apartment's infrastructure itself, specifically the old metal air conditioning vents. I'd pause, kill the audio on my monitors, and listen. The sound would stop, leaving only the low hum of the refrigerator. I'd chalk it up to the building settling, or a neighbor's television, but it was persistent, and it was getting clearer. It was a voice, or rather, the acoustic footprint of one. It was low, intimate, and profoundly wrong. It felt like someone breathing directly into my ear. But from across the room, I checked the locks, scan the hallway, and find nothing. My logical mind, the one that pays taxes and pitches to clients, was running diagnostics, searching for a rational explanation, a draft, a loose fitting. Then, one night, the sibilants coalesced. It wasn't just noise, it was a word, a name, my mother's name. A cold shock, sharp and immediate, bypassed my spine and went straight to my stomach. My mother has been gone for a decade. Her name, spoken in this house, was reserved for my own thoughts, my own moments of quiet grief. To hear it whispered from a metal grate in the wall felt like a violation of the highest order. The sadness that had been a dull ache for 10 years was instantly weaponized, twisted into a spike of pure, adrenalized fear. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. The apartment was dead quiet. The whisper had done its job. It had issued the summons. "Who's there?" I called out, the sound of my own voice embarrassingly loud. Silence. No, not silence. A new sound. From the bedroom, a faint, rhythmic creak. Creak, creak. I moved slowly, every nerve alive and screaming. The whisper from the vent had been the hook. This was the line, reeling me in. I pushed open the bedroom door. The room was dark, save for the blue-white chemical light of the street lamp outside, filtering through the blinds. The creaking was louder here. It was coming from the closet. My heart was a piston, hammering against my ribs. This wasn't rational. This wasn't structural. This was operational. Something was in my closet. My hand found the light switch. I flicked it. The overhead light flooded the room, harsh and unforgiving, and the creaking stopped. For a second, there was nothing, just my bedroom, my unmade bed, my dresser, and the closet. The door was slightly ajar. I walked toward it, a terrible, magnetic dread pulling me forward. Just open it. Show yourself there's nothing there. End this. I gripped the handle and pulled the door open. She was there. It was my mother, hanging, not from a rope, but suspended in the center of the closet, her feet a foot off the floor, surrounded by my neatly hung shirts. Her head was bowed, and a curtain of long, dark hair obscured her face completely, hiding whatever expression it held. She was wearing the dress I remembered from my childhood, the simple blue one she wore on weekends. I couldn't breathe. My brain simply refused to process the image, this fusion of my deepest, most private grief with this obscene, invasive horror. The sadness I felt was so profound it was paralyzing, a weight that crushed my lungs. But beneath it, a more primal terror was clawing its way up. "Mum!" The word was a choked gasp. Her head twitched, a bird-like, unnatural jerk. I screamed. It wasn't a word. It was just a raw expulsion of air and panic. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and fell hard against the wall. I blinked, just once, a reflex against the terror, and she was gone. The closet was just a closet. My shirts hung limp and motionless. The air was still. There was no one there. There was nothing. I stayed on the floor for God knows how long, hyperventilating, trying to force the image out of my head. It was a hallucination, a waking nightmare. Stress and grief conspiring to break my mind. That had to be it. I had not seen that. I eventually dragged myself to bed, but I didn't sleep. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun. When morning finally came, I felt hungover, ravaged. I got up to splash water on my face, and as I gripped the sink, I saw my arm in the mirror, from my right wrist to my elbow. 3 long, parallel lines were carved into my skin. They were deep, red, and inflamed. They looked less like scratches and more like chemical burns. Drawn with a ruler's precision, I touched one, and a sharp, fiery pain, rat bong, a burning sting, shot up my arm. This was the moment the floor fell out. The vision in the closet. My mind could have fabricated that. It was a projection of my own trauma, but this was data. This was tangible evidence. This was a physical invoice for a service I hadn't ordered. The fear from the night before was nothing compared to this cold, stark realization. The sadness was gone, replaced by a chilling clarity. This wasn't a haunting. This was an infection, and it had just drawn blood. The next night, sleep wasn't a choice. It was an inevitability. My body simply shut down, and I dreamed. It wasn't a normal dream. It was lucid, hyper-realistic, the colours oversaturated. I was in a void, and in front of me stood a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7. She was holding a porcelain doll that was wearing a simple, bright red dress. The doll was missing a shoe. The girl didn't look at me. She just stared at the doll with a look of intense, serious concentration. She smoothed its dress and whispered, her voice clear as a bell in the empty space. She found her shoes. That was it. I woke up with a jolt. The sun just beginning to light the room. The dream was already fading, but the feeling of it remained that same cold, operational wrongness. My left hand was clenched. I opened it. Resting in my palm was a small, torn scrap of fabric. It was bright red, the exact same color as the doll's dress from my dream. It was coarse, like old velvet, and smelled faintly of dust and something sweet, like dried flowers. I looked at it, and a chain of logic locked into place with a series of sickening, heavy clicks. The scratches, the dream, this red cloth. She found her shoes. I got out of bed, the piece of cloth still clutched in my hand. I didn't want to, but I had to. I walked to the closet, the same closet from 2 nights ago. I opened it. I looked past my shirts, past my own shoes on the floor, to the back corner. There was a small wooden box there, one that had held my mother's keepsakes. I hadn't opened it in years. Sitting on top of it was a doll, a small porcelain doll. I had no memory of this doll. It wasn't mine. It wasn't my mother's. But it was here. It was wearing a simple red dress, and it was wearing a pair of tiny, black, patent leather shoes. One of the shoes looked new, stark and black against the faded red of the dress. The other was coated in dust and cobwebs, as if it had been recently retrieved from some dark, forgotten place. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, the whisper in the vent, the apparition of my mother, the scratches on my arm. It wasn't random torment. It wasn't about scaring me. It was a process, a transaction. The entity had used my grief to get my attention. It had used me, my energy, my fear, my very presence, to complete its task. The girl in the dream wasn't a phantom. She was a stakeholder. The red cloth in my hand wasn't a dream artifact. It was a receipt. The link was forged. The doll was complete, and I understood, with a certainty that chilled my soul, that this wasn't the end. This was the completion of phase 1. The toy was now assembled, and whatever it was ready to play. The Texas Shadow. It's often said that everything is bigger in Texas. The sky, the highways, the ambitions. But what they don't tell you is that the shadows are bigger, too, and the silence. I was 12 years old when I first saw it. 12 is a strange, liminal age. You're shedding the skin of childhood, but aren't yet equipped for the armor of adulthood. You're vulnerable, porous, and things that shouldn't be able to get in find a way. Our house was a standard Texas suburban build, brick, sprawling, and always fighting the oppressive summer heat. The air conditioner was a constant, humming presence, a mechanical lung that kept the 100-degree humidity at bay. My room was at the end of a long, carpeted hallway, a beige tunnel that seemed to collect shadows even in the middle of the day. This memory isn't hazy, as so many childhood recollections are. It's etched in high definition, like a piece of film negative I can't throw away. It was late, past midnight. The rest of the house was asleep, submerged in that deep, quiet rhythm of the suburbs. I had gotten up for water. As I walked back, I stopped at the threshold of my room. Something was wrong. There was no sound, no draft. But moving across the illuminated rectangle of my doorway, cast from the hall light behind me, was a shape. It wasn't a person. It was a negation of a person. It was a man-shaped mass of absolute black, like a hole had been punched in the fabric of the world. It was tall, easily 7 feet, and had dimension. It wasn't flat, like a shadow on the wall. It was a 3-dimensional thing, a column of smoke and void. It slid, not walked, from one side of the doorframe to the other, disappearing into the dark of my room. The most disturbing part? The silence. There was no footfall, no rustle of clothing, not even the whisper of displaced air. It was a vacuum passing by. I stood there for a full minute, my heart a cold knot in my chest. I processed it with a 12-year-old's logic. I was tired. It was a hypnagogic hallucination, a sleepy eye trick. I convinced myself it was harmless, a figment of an overactive imagination. I took a deep breath, stepped into the room, and got into bed. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't want to know if it was still there. I was wrong. It wasn't harmless. The visitations started subtly. The first signal was the smell. It began about a week later. I would wake up in the dead of night, suddenly alert. The room would be filled with the cloying, overpoweringly sweet scent of lilies, not the fresh, pleasant aroma of a flower shop, but the heavy, funereal smell of flowers that are a day past their prime, the kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat. I would check the window. It was locked, sealed tight against the Texas night. The air conditioner was humming its steady drone. There was no source for the smell. It was an olfactory invasion. It was the signal of its presence, a calling card left on the nightstand of my consciousness. The scent was a perimeter, a way of it saying, "This room is no longer just yours." Then the pressure began. It wasn't just a feeling of being watched. It was a tangible weight. I would be doing homework at my desk, and the air in the room would suddenly feel dense, as if the barometric pressure had spiked. It felt like being at the bottom of a swimming pool, an unseen pressure, a restrained, patient force that pushed on my eardrums and made the small hairs on my arms stand up. The entity, it seemed, was growing bored of being passive. It wanted to interact. I was at the dinner table one evening, finishing a late meal alone. I had my plate, a glass of water, and a fork. I remember looking down at my notebook, reading a line of text, and then, zip, a flash of silver. The fork on my plate, which had been resting securely, launched itself from the table. It didn't roll off. It didn't slide. It flew in a perfectly straight horizontal line, as if thrown by an invisible, petulant child. It struck the kitchen cabinet on the far side of the room with a sharp clang and fell to the linoleum floor. I didn't move. I just stared at the fork. The distance was easily 15 feet. There was no explanation, no vibration, no earthquake, no draft. This was a breach of physics. This was a statement. But the worst was the television. Our old CRT television was in the small den connected to my room. It had a habit of making settling noises, the tick-tick-tick of cooling plastic. But this was different. I woke up. The clock on my bedside table read 3:07 a.m. The house was dead silent. And then, from the den, came a sharp click. The television screen flared to life, filling the doorway with a frantic, pulsing blue-white light. It wasn't on a channel. It was static, a roaring, electronic blizzard that filled the house with a sound like a million uncontainable whispers. I lay in bed, paralyzed. The sound was deafening. And then, the channels started to change. Click. A black and white movie. Click. A Spanish-language telenovela. Click. A smiling politician. Click. A home shopping network. Click. 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 It accelerated, the images flashing by in a nauseating, incoherent stream, all underpinned by that screaming static simis. It was electronic chaos. A machine having a seizure. It felt malicious. It wasn't just a malfunction. It was deliberate. It was a performance. It was the entity flexing its muscles, showing me what it could do. It was pure psychological warfare, and at that moment, the 12-year-old's fear finally gave way to a surge of adrenaline-fueled rage. This thing was in my house, in my room. It was terrifying me, and I was tired of it. I sat bolt upright, my voice shaking but loud. "Get out! Leave me alone! Get out of my room!" The effect was instantaneous. The television clicked off, not into standby, but off. The static, the voices, the flashing light, all extinguished at once. The room was plunged back into darkness and silence. Even the smell of lilies, which had been coiling in the air, vanished. I sat there, breathing hard, my own shouts still ringing in my ears. It was over. The pressure in the room evaporated. I had won. I had stood up to it, and it had retreated. I felt a surge of exhausted, triumphant relief. I eventually fell back asleep, convinced the nightmare was over. The next morning, I woke up feeling hungover. The sun was streaming through the blinds. The encounter felt distant, like a fever dream. I got up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and shuffled into the attached bathroom. I turned on the faucet, splashed cold water on my face, and reached for a towel. As I looked up, I met my own eyes in the mirror, and my heart stopped. It was there. It was standing directly behind me, close enough that I should have felt it. It was the same shadow. It was tall, towering over me, but this time I could see it clearly in the bright morning light of the bathroom. The prompt had described it perfectly. It was tall, and it was invisible from the neck down. What I saw in the mirror was a head, a perfectly formed, three-dimensional head and a neck, sculpted from that same suffocating, light-devouring blackness. It had no features, no eyes, no mouth. It was just a black, ovoid shape. Below the neck, there was nothing, just the normal reflection of my bathroom tiles. It was a floating, solid black head, hovering a foot above my own shoulder. It wasn't a shadow on the wall. It was a reflection of a thing that was physically in the room with me, a thing my own eyes couldn't see, but the mirror could. It had been there all night. It had been there when I screamed. It had simply let me think I had won. It had been standing in the corner of my room, or perhaps at the foot of my bed, watching me sleep. I didn't scream. I couldn't. It was the kind of terror that bypasses your lungs and larynx and goes straight to your limbs, freezing them solid. It was a silent, internal implosion of raw panic. I stood there, locked in place, staring at the faceless black shape behind me in the glass. It didn't move. It just was. I don't know how long I stood there. 5 seconds? A minute? Eventually, I broke the gaze, ripped the bathroom door open, and fled the room. I didn't go back in until my father came home from work that evening. We moved out of that house 6 months later. I never told anyone what I saw. How could I? But even now, as an adult, I can't be in a room with lilies, and I always check the reflection in the mirror, just for a second longer than I need to, just to make sure I'm the only one there. The Luminous Girl, 3:30 a.m. For entrepreneurs, for creators, for anyone trying to build something from nothing, sleep isn't always a given. It becomes a commodity, something you budget for and often fail to acquire. For me, insomnia wasn't an ailment, it was a baseline. It had been my companion for years, a silent partner in the relentless grind. My mind, perpetually cluttered with projections, deadlines, and the quiet anxieties of the future, simply refused to power down. That night was no different. The clock on the wall, a minimalist circle of brushed steel, marked 3:30 a.m. The world outside my city apartment was frozen in that profound, sterile silence that only exists in the hours before dawn. It was cold, not just a drop in temperature, but a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to seep through the double-glazed windows and settle into the concrete of the building itself. I wasn't working. I was, for a change, attempting to disconnect. I sat by the window in my favorite leather armchair, a heavy book open on my lap. Though I'd been staring at the same paragraph for 10 minutes, the only light in the room came from a single reading lamp, casting a small, warm cone onto the pages. Outside, the street was a palette of cold tones. The sodium vapor streetlights cast a sickly, hesitant orange, but the ambient light of the moon, filtered through a high, thin layer of clouds, washed everything else in a spectral blue-white. It was the color of a computer screen in a dark room, the color of isolation. My eyes drifted from the text, drawn to the empty street below. This was my routine. Read, stare, sip cold water, wait for the caffeine to wear off, and hope for exhaustion to finally claim me. Then I saw it. It wasn't it, not at first. It was just movement, a flicker of light in my periphery, down on the pavement. My first logical thought was a car's headlights turning a corner, but the light didn't sweep. It drifted. I leaned forward, the old leather of the chair groaning in protest, breaking the silence of the room. I squinted, trying to process the data. It was a girl, or the shape of one. She was bathed in her own illumination, not a glow like a lamp, but a vibrant, pulsing luminescence. It was the exact cold blue-white color of the moonlight, as if she had swallowed a piece of the sky. The light wasn't just on her, it was her. It radiated from her form, obscuring her features in a brilliant, chilling fog. She wasn't walking. This was the first detail my brain registered as wrong. She was gliding. Her movement was utterly smooth, like a camera on a dolly track, moving along the cracked pavement at a steady, unhurried pace. There was no bob or sway, no hint of a human gait. I watched, holding my breath. The book in my lap suddenly felt impossibly heavy. My mind, trained to analyze and deconstruct, scrambled for an explanation, a reflection. No, the street was empty. A new type of drone, a prank. But at 3:30 a.m. in this biting cold, the logic didn't track. She was moving closer. As she passed under the cone of a streetlight, the artificial orange light seemed to recoil from her, drowned out by her own cold, internal brilliance. And then I saw the second wrong thing, the detail that made the air in my lungs turn to ice. I looked for her feet. There were none. Her form, draped in what looked like a simple, light-colored dress, was solid from the torso up, but below the knee, she simply dissolved. Her legs were nothing but tendrils of that same blue-white light, trailing an inch or two above the concrete, leaving no shadow. She was untethered from the ground, a ghost in the most literal sense. I felt a prickle of cold sweat on my neck. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't a dream. I was wide awake, my senses sharp, my pulse suddenly, a heavy drumbeat in my ears. She stopped, directly across the street from my window. She just ceased moving. The stillness was absolute. The city was silent. The only sound was the faint hum of my refrigerator, a distant reminder of the normal world. For a long moment, she remained perfectly still, a silent beacon of impossible light. I was frozen, my hand gripping the arm of the chair. I was a spectator, watching something that shouldn't exist. Something that broke every rule of the reality I had built my life around. Then, very slowly, her head tilted. It was a small, inquisitive gesture, but it was aimed directly at me. She wasn't looking at the building. She wasn't looking at the window. She was looking at me. I couldn't see her eyes. The light was too bright, too diffused, but I felt the gaze. It was a cold, direct pressure. A feeling of being perceived, catalogued. There was no malice in it, no anger, just a vast, empty, inhuman curiosity. It was the stillness, the quiet assessment, that triggered a primal, a visceral fear. This thing was not of my world, and it knew I was there. My carefully constructed adult logic shattered. I was no longer an entrepreneur, a creator, a man reading a book. I was a child in the dark. I reacted instinctively. I lunged forward and yanked the heavy velvet curtain shut, the brass rings scraping loudly against the metal rod. The sound was a violation in the quiet room. I stood there, my back to the window, my chest heaving. My heart was a captured bird, beating itself against my ribs. I stared at the dark velvet, as if the fabric could somehow push back the reality of what I had just seen. It was a hallucination, just stress, lack of sleep. You're overworked. You imagined it. I repeated the mantra, clinging to it, but my body knew I was lying. Silence. A heavy, oppressive silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity. A minute, maybe two. The only sound was my own breathing, quick and shallow. Then came the tap. It was not a knock, not a bang. It was a single, soft thud, a dull pop against the glass, right behind my head. Cock. It was the sound of something soft, perhaps a fingertip, lightly striking the pane. My blood ran cold. She had been on the pavement. I was on the second floor. There was no fire escape, no ledge, nothing. The physics were impossible. The tap was an intimate, direct violation. It meant she had crossed the street and scaled the wall. Or, more terrifyingly, simply arrived. In the 2 seconds it took me to close the curtain, I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was an active, waiting silence. The barrier of the window was gone. She was there. She was right there. My professional life is built on facing problems. You don't run from a bad balance sheet. You don't ignore a difficult client. You face the data. Slowly, my hand trembling. I reached for the edge of the curtain. I didn't pull it open. I just eased the fabric back. A single inch. Enough for one eye to see. Nothing. The street was empty. The cold, blue-white light was gone. The sickly orange streetlights had reclaimed the pavement. There was no one on the sidewalk. No one pressed against my window. A wave of dizzying relief washed over me, so strong my knees almost buckled. It was a hallucination, a stress-induced night terror. While I was still awake, my rational mind eagerly seized on the explanation. I let go of the curtain, took a deep, shuddering breath, and forced a laugh that sounded more like a choke. I stepped back, my heart rate beginning its slow descent from its frantic peak. My hand went to the glass, perhaps to ground myself, to feel the cold, solid barrier between me and the world. And I touched it. It wasn't the smooth, cold glass I expected. Right where the tap had been, at the exact height of a person's face, there was a patch of condensation, a faint, greasy fog. I stared, my mind refusing to connect the dots. I flicked on the main overhead light, flooding the room with stark, clinical brightness. It wasn't just a smudge. It was a print, a perfect, misty outline of a human face, pressed against the outside of the glass. I could see the faint ovals of closed eyes, the delicate bridge of a nose, the subtle, tragic curve of lips. She had been there. Her face had been pressed against my window, and she had left proof. Sleep was no longer an option. The sun wouldn't rise for another 3 hours. But the night, for me, was over. The rules had changed. I sat in that brightly lit room until morning, the book forgotten, staring at the small, fading print on the window, an impossible receipt for a transaction I never wanted to make. The luminous girl, 3:30 a.m. For entrepreneurs, for creators, for anyone trying to build something from nothing. Sleep isn't always a given. It becomes a commodity, something you budget for and often fail to acquire. For me, insomnia wasn't an ailment. It was a baseline. It had been my companion for years, a silent partner in the relentless grind. My mind, perpetually cluttered with projections, deadlines, and the quiet anxieties of the future, simply refused to power down. That night was no different. The clock on the wall, a minimalist circle of brushed steel, marked 3:30 a.m. The world outside my city apartment was frozen in that profound, sterile silence that only exists in the hours before dawn. It was cold, not just a drop in temperature, but a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to seep through the double-glazed windows and settle into the concrete of the building itself. I wasn't working. I was, for a change, attempting to disconnect. I sat by the window in my favourite leather armchair, a heavy book open on my lap. Though I'd been staring at the same paragraph for 10 minutes, the only light in the room came from a single reading lamp, casting a small, warm cone onto the pages. Outside, the street was a palette of cold tones. The sodium vapor streetlights cast a sickly, a hesitant orange, but the ambient light of the moon, filtered through a high, thin layer of clouds, washed everything else in a spectral blue-white. It was the colour of a computer screen in a dark room, the colour of isolation. My eyes drifted from the text, drawn to the empty street below. This was my routine. Read, stare, sip cold water, wait for the caffeine to wear off, and hope for exhaustion to finally claim me. Then I saw it. It wasn't a it. Not at first. It was just movement, a flicker of light in my periphery, down on the pavement. My first logical thought was a car's headlights turning a corner, but the light didn't sweep. It drifted. I leaned forward, the old leather of the chair groaning in protest, breaking the silence of the room. I squinted, trying to process the data. It was a girl, or the shape of one. She was bathed in her own illumination, not a glow like a lamp, but a vibrant, pulsing luminescence. It was the exact, cold, blue-white colour of the moonlight, as if she had swallowed a piece of the sky. The light wasn't just on her, it was her. It radiated from her form, obscuring her features in a brilliant, chilling fog. She wasn't walking. This was the first detail my brain registered as wrong. She was gliding. Her movement was utterly smooth, like a camera on a dolly track, moving along the cracked pavement at a steady, unhurried pace. There was no bob or sway, no hint of a human gait. I watched, holding my breath. The book in my lap suddenly felt impossibly heavy. My mind, trained to analyze and deconstruct, scrambled for an explanation, a reflection. No, the street was empty. A new type of drone? A prank? But at 3:30 a.m. in this biting cold, the logic didn't track. She was moving closer. As she passed under the cone of a streetlight, and the artificial orange light seemed to recoil from her, drowned out by her own cold, internal brilliance. And then I saw the second wrong thing, the detail that made the air in my lungs turn to ice. I looked for her feet. There were none. Her form, draped in what looked like a simple, light-coloured dress, was solid from the torso up, but below the knee, she simply dissolved. Her legs were nothing but tendrils of that same blue-white light, trailing an inch or two above the concrete, leaving no shadow. She was untethered from the ground, a ghost in the most literal sense. I felt a prickle of cold sweat on my neck. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't a dream. I was wide awake, my senses sharp, my pulse suddenly a heavy drumbeat in my ears. She stopped, directly across the street from my window. She just ceased moving. The stillness was absolute. The city was silent. The only sound was the faint hum of my refrigerator, a distant reminder of the normal world. For a long moment, she remained perfectly still, a silent beacon of impossible light. I was frozen, my hand gripping the arm of the chair. I was a spectator, watching something that shouldn't exist, something that broke every rule of the reality I had built my life around. Then, very slowly, her head tilted. It was a small, inquisitive gesture, but it was aimed directly at me. She wasn't looking at the building. She wasn't looking at the window. She was looking at me. I couldn't see her eyes. The light was too bright, too diffused, but I felt the gaze. It was a cold, direct pressure, a feeling of being perceived, catalogued. There was no malice in it, no anger, just a vast, empty, inhuman curiosity. It was the stillness, the quiet assessment, that triggered a primal, visceral fear. This thing was not of my world, and it knew I was there. My carefully constructed adult logic shattered. I was no longer an entrepreneur, a creator, a man reading a book. I was a child in the dark. I reacted instinctively. I lunged forward and yanked the heavy velvet curtain shut. the brass rings scraping loudly against the metal rod. The sound was a violation in the quiet room. I stood there, my back to the window, my chest heaving. My heart was a captured bird, beating itself against my ribs. I stared at the dark velvet, as if the fabric could somehow push back the reality of what I had just seen. It was a hallucination, just stress, lack of sleep. You're overworked. You imagined it. I repeated the mantra, clinging to it, but my body knew I was lying. Silence, a heavy, oppressive silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity. A minute, maybe two. The only sound was my own breathing, quick and shallow. Then came the tap. It was not a knock, not a bang. It was a single, soft thud. A dull pop against the glass. Right behind my head. Cock. It was the sound of something soft, perhaps a fingertip, lightly striking the pane. My blood ran cold. She had been on the pavement. I was on the second floor. There was no fire escape, no ledge, nothing. The physics were impossible. The tap was an intimate, direct violation. It meant she had crossed the street and scaled the wall, or more terrifyingly, simply arrived. In the 2 seconds it took me to close the curtain, I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was an active, waiting silence. The barrier of the window was gone. She was there. She was right there. My professional life is built on facing problems. You don't run from a bad balance sheet. You don't ignore a difficult client. You face the data, slowly, my hand trembling. I reached for the edge of the curtain. I didn't pull it open. I just eased the fabric back, a single inch. Enough for one eye to see. Nothing. The street was empty. The cold blue-white light was gone. The sickly orange streetlights had reclaimed the pavement. There was no one on the sidewalk. No one pressed against my window. A wave of dizzying relief washed over me. So strong my knees almost buckled. It was a hallucination, a stress-induced night terror while I was still awake. My rational mind eagerly seized on the explanation. I let go of the curtain, took a deep, shuddering breath, and forced a laugh that sounded more like a choke. I stepped back, my heart rate beginning its slow descent from its frantic peak. My hand went to the glass, perhaps to ground myself, to feel the cold, solid barrier between me and the world, and I touched it. It wasn't outfitted smooth, cold glass I expected, right where the tap had been, at the exact height of a person's face. There was a patch of condensation, a faint, greasy fog. I stared, my mind refusing to connect the dots. I flicked on the main overhead light, flooding the room with stark, clinical brightness. It wasn't just a smudge, it was a print, a perfect, misty outline of a human face, pressed against the outside of the glass. I could see the faint ovals of closed eyes, the delicate bridge of a nose, the subtle, tragic curve of lips. She had been there. Her face had been pressed against my window, and she had left proof. Sleep was no longer an option. The sun wouldn't rise for another 3 hours, but the night, for me, was over. The rules had changed. I sat in that brightly lit room until morning, the book forgotten, staring at the small, fading print on the window, an impossible receipt for a transaction I never wanted to make. When things watched for a week, there was nothing. After the final, desperate confrontation, the slammed doors, the flickering lights, the impossible reflection of the girl in the hallway mirror, the apartment settled into a profound, almost luxurious silence. The knocking ceased, the cold spots vanished, the shadows retreated to their rightful corners. I, in turn, did what any rational man would do. I began to rebuild my sanity. We, especially those of us who stake our lives on logic, on systems, on the predictable flow of input and output, are experts at rationalization. The mind builds a fortress. The haunting, I told myself, was a stress-induced anomaly, a perfect storm of sleep deprivation and isolation, a project deadline looming, A glitch in the matrix. The girl was a hallucination. The noises were the building's old bones settling. I slept. I worked. I drank expensive coffee and meticulously organized my calendar. I was back in control. The silence wasn't empty. It was a return to profitability. It was the sound of a problem solved. But the entity I was learning was a far better strategist than I. It began on a Tuesday. I woke up not to a sound, but to a change in pressure, a draft. My eyes opened to the darkness of the bedroom, and I saw the sliver of grey light from the hallway. The bedroom door was ajar. I never leave it open. It's part of my nightly system. Check the locks, power down the screens, close the bedroom door, a closed loop. Yet, there it was, open perhaps 6 inches. My first thought was logic. I must have forgotten. I got up, a spike of adrenaline making my skin prickle, and pushed it shut. The latch clicked into place with a satisfying metallic snap. Secure. I went back to bed. I blamed it on myself. The next night, I made a point of checking the handle. I pulled it taut against the frame. Locked. Secure. I woke up at 3:07 a.m. The door was open. This time, I didn't move. I lay perfectly still, my heart a trapped bird against my ribs. I stared into that sliver of grey, waiting. I listened. The silence of the apartment was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was the silence of a boardroom after a hostile bid has been placed, where everyone is waiting for the other shoe to drop. Nothing happened. After an hour, I got up, shut it, and tried to sleep. The following night, the cold woke me. My legs were exposed. I reached down. The thick duvet, which I always keep pulled to my chin, had been methodically, neatly folded back to the foot of the bed. Not ripped off, not pulled, folded. This was the first true crack in my fortress. A door opening could be a faulty latch, but this was a personal, deliberate act. It was a violation of territory. It was someone, or something, tidying up my defences. I sat up, the cold air biting at my skin. "Who's there?" I demanded. The silence that answered was not empty. It was weighted. It was the silence of observation. I stopped sleeping. I survived on caffeine and paranoia, working late into the night, my laptop a solitary beacon in the living room. I set up a security camera, a simple Nest Cam I used for the office, on the bookshelf, pointed at my bedroom door. If a system was broken, I would diagnose the bug. I sat on the sofa, feigning sleep, and watched the live feed on my phone for hours. The image was static, the hallway, the closed door, the timestamp ticking over in the corner, 2:50 a.m., 3:00 a.m., 3:06 a.m. At 3:07 a.m., precisely, I watched the screen. My eyes burned. Nothing moved. The door did not open, but a sound clicked on in the living room with me. I flinched, dropping the phone, the television. The screen flared to life, not with a program, but with a universe of grey, hissing static. The sound was a low, resonant hum, filling the space where the silence had been. It wasn't loud, but it was invasive. It vibrated in my teeth. I stared at it, my blood turning to ice. The remote was on the coffee table, untouched. I was alone, and then, on my phone, the camera feed updated. The bedroom door was wide open. I didn't check the footage. I knew what I would see. I knew the camera would show nothing. No hand on the knob, no figure in the hall. It would just be open. The blanket in the other room would be folded. The horror was not in the act, but in the result. It was a magic trick performed by a malevolent god. This was the new protocol. The girl was gone. The screaming was gone. The primitive, brutish tactics of a common haunting were over. This was different. This was intelligent. This was an audit. It had studied me. It knew I wasn't afraid of a screaming spectre. I was a man who builds systems, a man who fears the loss of control. So it dismantled my systems. It didn't break the door. It unlatched it. It didn't steal the blanket. It moved it. It didn't show me a monster, it turned on a machine. The haunting had become an operation, a systematic dismantling of my reality. The nightly rituals were no longer random, they were scheduled appointments. 3:07 a.m. was the new standard meeting time. The static was the agenda. I began to feel the weight of its presence. It was in the long, empty frames of the hallway. It was in the low, electronic hum that I started to hear even when the TV was off. It was the pressure in the air, the feeling of an unseen audience. I was no longer being haunted. I was being monitored. I'd sit at my desk, trying to work, and feel a gaze on the back of my neck. I'd turn, and there would be nothing but the empty kitchen. But the silence that followed was charged. It was the silence of an analyst who has just received new data. It was no longer trying to scare me away. It was no longer a ghost in the machine. It was the machine. One night, I gave up the pretense of work. I sat in the dark, hands steepled, like a CEO awaiting a verdict. I didn't need the camera. I just waited. The clock on my laptop read 3:06 a.m. I held my breath. 3:07 a.m. Click. The low hum of the television static filled the room. A slow creak from the bedroom as the door opened. A soft shush of fabric as the duvet, which I had angrily spread back out, was pulled, inch by inch, down toward the foot of the bed. I didn't scream. I didn't run. A cold, terrible clarity settled over me. Horror is not the entity that slams the door and wails in the night. That is simple. Primal fear. That is an animal marking its territory. True. Sophisticated horror is the entity that watches you, the one that learns your routines, your defenses, and your breaking points, the one that realizes you are fortified against noise, so it chooses silence. It doesn't need to show itself. It doesn't need to scream. It just needs to move the pieces on the board. To prove that your control is an illusion, it sits in the quiet, and it watches. And the most terrifying realization of all, the one that finally broke me, was this. The knocking and the lights hadn't failed to scare me. They were just the first draft. They were the market research it learned, it optimized, it learned to stay quiet. Rachel at the end of the line. You know, Sam, in business, we talk about pivots. Those moments where the entire trajectory of a company or a life shifts on a dime. We analyze them, we praise them, we fear them, but we rarely see them for what they are at the granular level, a series of small, almost imperceptible at first deviations that, in hindsight, were warning flares. I've been thinking about my own pivot, the one that happened not in a boardroom, but at the end of a suburban cul-de-sac. The one that introduced the logic of the irrational into my world. It was all about Rachel. When my family first moved to that house in Oregon, the cul-de-sac felt like the edge of the world. It was a perfect semicircle of 5 houses, and beyond the last driveway, a heavy-duty municipal barrier. Beyond that, the forest, not a park, not the woods, but the forest. The kind of deep, damp, Pacific Northwest wilderness that feels ancient and indifferent. Rachel lived 2 doors down. She was just Rachel, a stock character in any suburban childhood. She was lanky, always in shorts, and the sound of our summer was the incessant thwack, thwack, thwack of her basketball on the pavement. She wasn't a friend, not really. She was a fixed point, a piece of the landscape. The day I truly saw her as something other than the basketball girl was the day the metronome stopped. It was a Tuesday. I think dusk was setting in, that thick, blue-grey light that makes shadows leap. I was in my upstairs bedroom, the one overlooking the street, and I realized I hadn't heard the basketball all day. The silence was what drew my eye to the window, and there she was. She was standing at the barrier at the end of the road. She was wearing a red plaid hoodie, the hood down. She just stood there, staring into the blackness of the trees. It had been raining, and the air was heavy with the smell of petrichor and pine. I watched her for maybe a full minute before she did something that fractured the reality of our little street. She climbed the barrier. It wasn't a casual hop. It was a deliberate, almost unnervingly fluid movement, like a cat clearing a fence. And she didn't hesitate. She stepped off the pavement and was immediately swallowed by the forest. No flashlight, no friend waiting, just gone. I told myself it was kids being weird, an adolescent exploration. But Sam, you know that feeling in your gut when a data point just doesn't fit the model. This was it. The next day, she was back, but she was wrong. She was sitting on her front porch steps when I went to get the mail. I said hi. She didn't turn her head, she just tilted it. And her eyes, Sam, this is the part I have trouble explaining. You know how a cat's eyes catch the light? That reflective, almost fluorescent quality. The tapetum lucidum. Her eyes were like that, in broad daylight. They seemed to gather the sun and burn it back. A cold, greenish gold fire. They weren't pupils and irises. They were orbs. She was perfectly, unnaturally still. The girl who was a bundle of kinetic energy, all elbows and dribbles, was now as immobile as a heron hunting. That stillness was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. The symbol was clear. Even if I didn't have the words for it then, this was no longer Rachel. This was something looking out of Rachel. The possession had begun. The pivot accelerated. The basketball lay forgotten by her garage, gathering mildew. We kids, me, my brother, and my sister, started to avoid her. She radiated a new kind of gravity, a cold spot in the summer air. Then came the day of the shed. Our grandparents had a small, rickety wooden shed at the back of their property, which bordered ours. It was a classic grandpa shed, smelling of motor oil, damp earth, and fertilizer. We were in there, the three of us, looking for, God, I don't even remember, a croquet mallet. Maybe. The light from the doorway was suddenly blocked. It was Rachel. She stood silhouetted against the bright afternoon, the red plaid hoodie casting her face in shadow. Before we could speak, she moved with that same liquid speed. She slammed the heavy wooden door, plunging us into near total darkness, broken only by a few slivers of light through the boards. We heard the thud and scrape of the heavy iron bolt sliding shut. My sister started to cry. A small, terrified sound bore. My brother and I rushed the door, pounding on it. Rachel, let us out. This isn't funny. And then, her voice. It came from right outside the door. A dry whisper that cut through the wood, through our skin, and right into our bones. If you open this door, she whispered, and the voice was layered like two sounds at once. I will hurt you. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of services, a contractual obligation. Sam, you understand contracts. You understand the weight of a declarative statement. This was the most binding one I've ever heard. We went silent. Then I saw it. To the left of the door, a single power cable ran from the main house to a junction box inside the shed, powering the one bare, greasy light bulb above us. In the dim light from the cracks, I saw her hand, pale and dirty, reach in through a gap in the warped siding. She gripped the power cord, and she pulled. The cable snapped free from the junction box with a violent pop and a shower of sparks that lit the shed for one strobe-like, hellish second. Then, absolute darkness, absolute silence. We screamed. We threw our shoulders against the door. We were animals in a trap. It took maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like an hour before the old, rotted wood of the door jamb finally splintered and gave way. We fell out onto the grass, gasping, blinded by the sun. She was gone. We ran. We didn't stop until we were in our kitchen, babbling, hysterical, telling our grandparents. I'll never forget the look on my grandfather's face. He was a logical man, an engineer. He didn't understand possessed. He understood delinquent. He went straight over to her house. We watched from the window as he spoke to Rachel's mother on her doorstep. We couldn't hear, but we could see. We saw her mother's composure crumble. We saw her hands fly to her face. We saw the racking sobs. Our grandparents came back an hour later. Their faces were grey. The explanation, as it was given to us, was a desperate, fragmented mosaic of parental failure and folkloric terror. Rachel's mother, hysterical, had confessed everything. The girl had been changing for weeks. She'd been found in the basement, in the dark, just sitting. She'd been playing with a Ouija board, alone. She would wake up in the middle of the night, vomiting. Though she wasn't sick, she was consulting with something. She was inviting something. They moved away 2 weeks later. The for sale sign went up, and they were gone. The basketball was left behind. Years passed. You grow up, you build a career. You learn to frame the world in rational terms, markets, metrics, strategies, deliverables. The irrational is sandpapered away, filed under childhood trauma or misremembered fantasy. You tell yourself it was a disturbed girl having a psychotic break. You tell yourself the cat eyes were a trick of the light. You tell yourself the voice was just your own fear. You tell yourself this, Sam, and you almost believe it. Until last night, I was telling this story to a new friend at a bar, trying to sound like an adult, like a content creator sharing a crazy anecdote. And then the girl, blah, blah, blah. I finished my drink, said my goodbyes, and got home. My phone, which had been on silent in my pocket, was dark. But as I set it on the charger, it lit up. One missed call. I didn't recognize the number, but the area code. The area code was 503. Portland, Oregon. My blood went cold. It was a reflex. I hit redial. I don't know what I expected. A wrong number? A disconnected message? The call connected. There was no voice, no hello, just sound. Sam. You know what the noise floor is on a bad recording? That room tone that's full of electrical hum? It was like that, a thick, abrasive static. It sounded like the phone had been left off the hook in a room where a million invisible insects were screaming, a dry, electric hiss. I listened, my heart hammering against my ribs, for 10, 20, 30 seconds. Hello? I said. The static didn't change. It just was. Rachel. A sudden, deafening click, as if the line had been severed with an axe. And then, silence. But it's not silence. Sam. It's the echo, the ringing, the dreadful, hollow sound of a line that's been left open. The knowledge that after all these years, something picked up the phone, and it's still listening. So, what do you think? Is true horror the loud, aggressive monster, or is it the silent, patient observer? The shadow that moves only when you're not quite looking. The streetlight that flickers only for you. This taps into a deep, universal fear. The idea that we are being watched by an intelligence we can't see. Many spiritual beliefs and folk traditions warn that to notice a spirit is to give it power over you. It's a two-way mirror. They are just shapes in the dark until our attention gives them mugs. By acknowledging the anomaly, the chill in the room, the noise in the hall, we aren't just observing it, we are inviting it in. We've validated its existence, and in return, it validates our fear. Once that connection is made, the line between their world and ours is permanently blurred. Have you ever noticed something that just wasn't right? Did you feel that click when it realized you saw it? Share your story in the comments below. And if you crave more tales from the shadows, subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next.